Ah, yes, you've gathered around the fire, haven't you? The flickering light dancing on your faces seems to reveal the foggy pages of the past before your eyes. There's a soft hum in your ears, the echo of history carried by the wind. Now let me start telling you the true story of the Crusades. Forgotten victories, betrayals, destruction, and sacrifices. But you must know that these campaigns were not just a series of battles, they were a time when bridges were built, destroyed, and rebuilt between the West and the East. So how did this epic era begin? Deep in the Middle Ages, amidst the dark shadows of Europe, people were looking up to the sky with hope. Plague, famine, and wars were suffocating the spirit of the people, who were searching for a glimmer of salvation. That glimmer of hope was the Holy Lands, Jerusalem. The roads walked by Jesus, the hill where he was crucified, the sacred ground where he rose again. The Christian kings in the West began to feel a deep discomfort with these lands being under Muslim control. In such a time, Pope Urban II made a call in Clermont. A call that would change the course of history, igniting flames across the West. God wills it. Can you imagine? The seeds of bloody struggles that would last for centuries were sown at that moment. The Pope's fiery speech echoed widely among the Christian kings and nobles in the West. But this call was not just a religious duty, it was also filled with worldly desires. Reclaiming Jerusalem wasn't just about gaining a place in heaven, it was an adventure promising new lands, loot, and glory. Many nobles eagerly awaited to join this war to pay off their debts to the church, expand their wealth, and of course solidify their fame. Now close your eyes and imagine that era. Hundreds of thousands of knights, peasants, monks, and even children set out from the castles of Europe. Yes, you heard it right. Even children participated in this holy war. This crowd, coming from all corners of the West, embarked on a long journey toward Jerusalem as God's army. However, this journey was not as glorious and easy as they had hoped. They faced hunger, disease, and conflicts along the way. Sometimes they even shed blood among themselves. Yet none of them took their eyes off the Holy Lands, because there in Jerusalem a victory, a glimmer of hope awaited them. When they captured Jerusalem, they would leave behind a victory written in blood, slaughtering Muslims, Jews, and even some Christians in the city. But behind this victory lay the cries of countless innocents, the shaking of faith, and the drowning of hope in darkness. The Crusades were a fusion of these contradictions: on one side, those acting in the name of God, and on the other, those enslaved by human desires. And thus this saga, which would last for centuries, began on that bloody road leading to Jerusalem. Did the Crusaders embark on this journey purely out of religious fervor, or were there entirely different motives at play? Was this a holy war, or was it a quest for power, land, and wealth? As we dive deeper into the Crusades, we'll seek answers to these questions as well. We will continue to explore the story of this dark, complex, yet captivating period in all its aspects. Now we're going to dive even deeper. Close your eyes and transport yourself to medieval Europe. Let the winds of your thoughts carry you to the dark and foggy cities of France, Germany, and England. Here a gloomy atmosphere ruled every corner of Europe. People lived in fear, with famine, disease, and wars hanging over them like a shadow. The plague was like a monster, spreading death through the streets of Europe. Most believed that God had turned away from them. Their spirits were shaken, and their hopes were gone. But these tough conditions affected not just the common folk, but also the nobles and church leaders. So how did the political and religious balances in Europe shape up in this atmosphere? Kings were locked in a relentless struggle to strengthen their thrones. They waged wars against each other, forming and breaking alliances. But the greatest power lay with the church, which controlled the souls of the people. In the Middle Ages, the church wasn't just a religious institution, it was also a political and economic giant. Its power was built on a foundation more solid than that of kings' thrones. The salvation of souls depended on priests' prayers and the church's decrees. This meant that the common people accepted every word from the popes and church leaders as law. In such a time, Pope Urban II stepped onto the stage. Before delivering that unforgettable speech in Clermont, the church had been preparing the people for years to reclaim the Holy Land. Jerusalem was the heart of the Christian world, and its being under Muslim control was a great embarrassment for the Christian kingdoms in Europe. However, reclaiming these lands was more than just a religious duty. Pope Urban II and the church seized this opportunity to further strengthen their political and economic power. The Holy War would reinforce the church's authority, unite the people again, and stabilize Europe's fragmented political structure. Do you remember Urban's passionate call? He shouted to the crowd, "God wills it." In that moment, thousands gathered in the square felt crushed under the weight of those words, believing that God had given them a direct mission. But behind Urban's call lay a much more complex plan. Europe was going through a tough economic time. The land's productivity had dropped, and famine was starting to appear. The troubles brought by the feudal system had made nobles look elsewhere. Reclaiming Jerusalem meant not just taking back a sacred land, but also gaining new trade routes, wealth, and riches. Many young nobles in Europe eagerly awaited the chance to join these campaigns to escape the difficulties of staying on their own lands. For knights, the crusade was not just a battle of faith, it was an opportunity to gain honor, wealth, and new territories. Pope Urban II knew this truth and anticipated that his call would resonate strongly among the nobles in Europe. In reality, Urban wanted to strengthen not only the Christian world but also his own authority through these campaigns. But there was another aspect: the church's spiritual role. By claiming that the Crusades were God's command, the church attracted the people and nobles with a sense of holy duty. According to the church's promises, anyone who joined the Crusades would have their sins forgiven. This was a major factor that increased public interest. The people, overwhelmed by years of civil wars, plague, and poverty, believed that their only salvation lay in joining this holy war. The church, as God's representative on earth, promised everyone who participated a place in heaven. Imagine. As people across Europe heard this promise, hope began to bloom within them. They were eager not just to save their souls but also to build a new life. These individuals, moving as God's army, were driven not only by religious motivation but also by hopes for economic and political salvation. Pope Urban II's historic call sparked a wave that would fundamentally change the social, economic, and political structure in Europe. And so the curtain rose on the Crusades. People from all over Europe listened to the Pope's call. But these campaigns wouldn't just be the holy struggle they expected. There would also be betrayals, ambitions, bloody battles, and the dark side of human nature. Yes, dear listeners, this was not just a war fought in the name of religion, it was a grand struggle for power, wealth, and more land. Now, are you ready to take the first steps together on this long and challenging journey? Now we're getting to the first big steps of those famous Crusades, right? Picture those dark, gloomy days in your mind. Think about this massive army setting out from Europe. They were on a sacred mission, but many of them didn't even know what they were up against. On one hand, they had their dreams to capture Jerusalem, to reclaim the lands promised to them by God, and to secure their place in heaven. On the other hand, this journey wasn't just about faith. It also included warrior spirits, greedy knights, and those dreaming of rich lands. Now let's see how these huge armies progressed step by step. After Pope Urban II's call to arms, thousands of people from all over Europe hit the road. Nobles, warriors, peasants, even women and children. It was such a massive movement that it wasn't just about the Christian faith. People suffering from hunger, poverty, and desperation were also searching for a new hope. Of course, bringing together these armies from different backgrounds wasn't easy at all. the French, Germans, Italians. They all continued their journeys under different leaders. Each army had its own interests and ambitions, but they were all united by one single goal: to reclaim Jerusalem. When the First Crusade began, a large part of the armies reached the lands of the Byzantine Empire. Now close your eyes and picture Constantinople back then. Majestic walls, gold-covered domes, and the enormous power of Byzantium. When Emperor Alexios I Komnenos saw this massive crowd approaching, he didn't know what to do. On one hand, he wanted to use the Crusader armies against the enemy, but on the other, it was tough to control such a strong and large group. For Byzantium, the real threat wasn't just the Muslims. These Christian crusaders could also threaten Byzantine sovereignty. In this complicated situation, the Crusaders, with the help of the Byzantine Empire, turned their sights to their first major target, Nicaea. This strategic city in Anatolia was under the control of the Seljuk Turks at the time. For the Crusaders, capturing Nicaea meant opening the gateway to Anatolia. The Seljuks were firmly defending this fortress, never expecting the Crusader armies to launch such an organized attack. But the enthusiasm and sheer numbers of the Crusaders overwhelmed the Seljuk defenses. After months of siege, Nicaea finally fell. The Crusaders had achieved their first major victory on the road to Jerusalem. However, this victory only fueled their excitement even more. Each of them wanted more. But before them lay an even tougher obstacle: Antioch. Antioch was one of the most important strategic stops on the way to the holy city of Jerusalem. The Crusaders needed to capture this large and powerful city before they could reach Jerusalem. This siege stands out as one of the most epic moments in history. Antioch was a fortified city, surrounded by strong walls, protected by mountains, and divided by deep valleys. The siege lasted for months. While the Crusader armies battled hunger, disease, and harsh weather conditions, they just couldn't manage to get inside Antioch. But sometimes history is shaped by unexpected events. At the end of the siege of Antioch, with the help of a traitor, the Crusaders slipped into the city. The gates of the fortress opened one night, and the Crusaders rushed in. Antioch fell, but conflicts between Muslims and Christians in the city grew even fiercer. However, this victory lifted the morale of the Crusaders once again. The road to Jerusalem was now open. Worn out and weakened, but with their faith intact, the Crusaders set out to capture Jerusalem. And Jerusalem. Jerusalem. This city was sacred to both sides, a piece of land fought over for centuries. By the year 1099, the Crusaders had reached Jerusalem. But the city was under the control of the Fatimids, and the Muslims were determined to defend this holy land to the end. When the Crusaders arrived at the walls of Jerusalem, they witnessed one of the bloodiest sieges in history. The city walls stood firm against the Crusaders' enthusiasm, but there was no turning back for the Crusader armies. Their faith, ambitions, and desire for victory motivated them. In the final days of the siege of Jerusalem, the walls were finally breached. When the Crusaders entered the city, the scene was horrifying. Blood was everywhere. A massacre occurred without mercy for women, children, or the elderly. Muslims, Jews, and even some Christians couldn't escape this slaughter. When the city fell into the hands of the Crusaders, this holy war fought in God's name had turned into a horrific violence. Yet for the Crusaders, this victory meant they had reached their greatest goal. They had reclaimed Jerusalem. Now the city of God was in their hands. And at this point, the foundations of the Crusader states were laid. New Christian states were established, such as the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the County of Edessa. These states became strong outposts of Christian armies in the heart of Muslim territories. However, this new order wouldn't bring lasting peace. The establishment of the Crusader states fundamentally changed the balance of power in the Middle East. The Crusaders, drunk with victory from capturing Jerusalem, had sown the seeds for future conflicts. Yes, dear friends, these were the first major steps of the Crusades. But this was just the beginning. We still have a long and bloody road ahead. Let's see how this struggle over the Holy Lands continues. Jerusalem. That sacred city the Crusaders claimed after their bloody and exhausting sieges. The Crusaders, who said they were fighting in the name of God, solidified their victory with a horrific massacre when they entered the city. Now Jerusalem was in the hands of the Christian Crusaders, not the Muslims. But ruling Jerusalem was far more challenging than conquering this holy city. It wasn't just about military victory. They had to manage the land, maintain control, and establish a new order. After capturing Jerusalem, the Crusaders set up a new government in the city. This new Crusader state, known as the Kingdom of Jerusalem, took control of the Christian population living there. However, this was no easy task. Muslims, Jews, and Christians lived together in the city, and managing these different groups required great skill and diplomacy. The first king to take the throne was Godfrey of Bouillon. Interestingly, he refused the title of king and instead took the title of defender of the Holy Sepulchre. Godfrey saw himself as a servant of God and believed it was his primary duty to protect the Holy Land. What about the internal structure of this new state? The Kingdom of Jerusalem had a strong central authority, but many nobles and warlords played active roles in the administration. Each of them was out to protect their own interests. Jerusalem continued to be a city for not only Christians but also for Muslims and Jews. The Crusaders imposed strict rules on their governance and made significant efforts to hold on to the holy city. While Muslims and Jews lived under harsh conditions, the Christians were determined to establish a new order in the region. However, the Kingdom of Jerusalem wasn't alone. After the initial Crusades, a series of Crusader states were established in the eastern Mediterranean. Tripoli, Antioch, Essa. Each of these states was a product of the Crusades. But these states didn't survive solely through warfare. The internal structure of the newly established Crusader states was complex. Knights, nobles, clergy, and merchants. Everyone was trying to find their place in this new order. Thanks to its strategic position, the Principality of Antioch became the heart of trade. The county of Tripoli played a crucial role in maritime commerce. These newly formed Crusader states needed to survive not just through military victories but also through economic and political relationships. Domestic policies were always complicated. On one side, there were powerful knightly armies. On the other, delicate balances were established with local populations and Muslim states. The Crusader states fought to maintain control of the land not just with swords but with diplomacy as well. Ceasefires with Muslim neighbors, trade agreements, and strategic marriages were key to the long-term survival of these states. However, any moment could ignite a new war, and everything could turn upside down. Still, the greatest challenges for these states came from within. Many Crusader leaders were consumed by ambition and power struggles. Each was chasing after more land and wealth. This created a constant tension and rivalry within the structure of the Crusader states. And let's not forget, the Crusaders' presence in the East was always under threat. Muslims were preparing to regain the lands they had lost, keeping an eye on the weaknesses of the Crusader states. So, dear friends, the story that began with the Crusaders' capture of Jerusalem opened the doors to a new era. But the struggle for these holy lands was far from over. How long could the states the Crusaders established in their state of victory withstand the great storms that awaited them in the future? We'll see together. Friends. While the West celebrated its victory in Jerusalem, the skies in the East were darkening. The victories of the Crusaders sparked not just their own story, but also the awakening of Muslim leaders in the East. At this crucial moment in history, a great commander named Imad-ad-Din Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul, stepped onto the stage. This formidable leader loomed like a nightmare over the lands controlled by the Crusader states, becoming a unifying force in the Muslim world. You know how they say, the rise of one hero often signals the fall of another. Well, Zengi's ascent was a harbinger of disaster for the Crusaders. This rising star from the east turned the Atabegate of Mosul into a major power. At that time, Mosul was a city everyone had their eyes on because of its political and strategic importance. With his military prowess and political genius, Imad-ad-Din Zengi transformed the Atabegate of Mosul from just a regional power into a beacon of hope for the Muslim world. His greatest ambition was to unite the Muslim lands and create a united front against the Crusaders. However, in Zengi's eyes, the biggest victory would be reclaiming Urfa. Urfa was considered one of the most significant successes of the Crusades. With its strategic position, it served as a gateway to both the east and the west. Having Urfa under Crusader control posed a significant threat, not just to the Muslim world, but also to trade routes between the east and west. But Zengi wouldn't accept this situation. In his plans, taking Urfa back from the Crusaders was essential for restoring the honor of the Muslim world. This determination of Zengi would pave the way for events that would change the course of history. The year was 1144. Zengi had been preparing for a long time against the Crusaders. Their defenses had weakened internal strife, and the ambitions among leaders had made the Crusader states surrounding Jerusalem fragile. Zengi seized this opportunity and directed his army towards Urfa. The Crusaders didn't expect a Muslim army to besiege Urfa so quickly. The city, with its strong walls and strategic position, seemed like a tough fortress to defend, but Zengi's plans were much more intricate. He sought victory not just with the sword, but also with strategy. The siege lasted for weeks. The Crusaders found themselves in despair. As Zengi's army approached the gates of Urfa, fear grew within the city. The Crusaders were waiting for help from outside, but neither the Kingdom of Jerusalem nor other Crusader states could reach them in time. This became Zengi's greatest victory. On a cold winter day in 1144, the walls of Urfa were no longer in Crusader hands, they belonged to the Muslims. By reclaiming Urfa, Imad-ad-Din Zengi became a great hero in the Muslim world. This victory marked the first major success of the Muslims over the Crusaders and dealt a devastating blow to them. The loss of Urfa sent shockwaves through the West. This city had been one of the first victories of the Crusades and symbolized the West's influence over the East. Zengi's capture of Urfa showcased the strength and determination of the Muslims to the West. The West was shaken by this defeat, and calls for a second crusade began to echo. However, Zengi's success wasn't just a military triumph. It also became a great source of morale for the Muslim world. It proved that greater victories against the Crusaders were indeed possible. With the victory at Urfa, Imad-ad-Din Zengi etched his name in history with golden letters. This victory was one of the events that changed the balance of the Crusades and ignited a spark for the unification of the Muslim world. But Zengi's legacy didn't end there. Those who followed carried the torch of this victory, further strengthening the Muslim world. The reclaiming of Urfa was a turning point in the history of the Crusades, and this turning point was made possible by Zengi's genius. Ah, friends, that's how a leader's rise in history unfolds, along with the legacy they leave behind. Zengi didn't just restore a city, he rekindled a hope. But this struggle wouldn't end here. The Crusaders wouldn't forget this defeat. They would regroup and feel a strong desire to return to the east. However, another storm awaited them. Ah, dear friends. As we moved closer to the Second Crusade, a stir began to emerge in the dark corners of Europe. Muslims gained significant momentum with Imad-ad-Din Zengi's victory in Urfa. Meanwhile, the West couldn't swallow this defeat. The loss of the Holy Lands dealt a deep blow to the honor of the Crusaders, and that wound blazed like a flame in the heart of Pope Eugene III. Pope Eugene III took it upon himself to unite the Christian world and reclaim these lands from the Muslims. As the most sacred leader of the Western world, he called upon Christian kingdoms once again for the Holy War. But this time, it wasn't just about faith. There were major strategic calculations, the ambitions of kingdoms, and deep political machinations at play. The Pope's call echoed throughout Europe. It wasn't just the voice of a spiritual leader, it was a cry to reclaim lost honor, power, and the splendor of the West. Among the first to respond were King Louis VII of France and King Conrad III of Germany. The idea of joining the crusade ignited a fire within these two great kings. For them, this expedition was not only a religious duty but also an opportunity for political victory. Louis VII aimed to strengthen France's power and transform the heroism of the Crusades into a legacy that would be remembered under his name. Meanwhile, King Conrad III did not want to miss the chance to reshape the balance of power in Europe. Thus, these two great kings decided to set out with their massive armies. The campaign began with high hopes and grandeur. As the armies marched east from Europe, crowds bid them farewell with prayers, sacred relics, and hymns. The Crusader armies were the most powerful military forces of the time. However, this campaign would turn out to be very different from the previous Crusades. As they advanced eastward, they faced not only Muslims but also difficult terrains, hunger, famine, and treachery along the way. Strategic mistakes, disagreements among commanders, and rivalries between leaders would cast a shadow over the expedition. Louis VII and Conrad I's armies faced significant resistance in Anatolia. The Seljuk Turks descended upon the Crusaders like a shadow. As the Crusaders tried to advance in this challenging landscape, their forces began to scatter, their supplies ran low, and their soldiers weakened. With each passing day, the Crusaders suffered more losses, stunned by the clever attacks of the Seljuks. Those magnificent Crusader armies were on the brink of collapse in Anatolian lands. The Seljuks' clever strategies and swift cavalry left the Crusaders feeling helpless. Ultimately, the defeats in Anatolia shattered the morale of the Crusaders. Nevertheless, the Crusader armies still hadn't given up on their desire to capture Jerusalem and the Holy Lands. Exhausted and disorganized, they reached Syria, where they faced more hardships. Nur ad-Din Zengi, who inherited the legacy of Imad-din Zengi, mounted a strong defense against the Crusaders. Under his leadership, Muslim forces would once again deal a severe blow to the Crusaders. What had started as a hopeful expedition for Louis VII and Conrad I was now turning into a disaster. In the end, although these Crusader armies managed to reach Jerusalem, they did not achieve their goals. The campaign's failure resulted in significant disappointment across Europe. For the kings of France and Germany, this expedition meant a loss of prestige. These leaders, who had anticipated victories in the East, were instead confronted with the harsh realities of the region. The Grand Crusade initiated by Pope Eugene III went down in history as a complete failure for the West. Armies that set out with the desire to reclaim the Holy Lands were forced to turn back. However, this failure did not mark the end of the Crusades. On the contrary, it further fueled religious fanaticism in Europe and hostility towards Muslims. Even though Pope Eugene III made a strong call for unity in the Western world, it bore no fruit. Nonetheless, the Crusades would continue to be a grand ideal in the Western world. The West would never give up its desire to possess the riches and sacred lands of the East. They would learn from this defeat, but they would also prepare for an even greater expedition. Dear friends, on this grand stage of history, sometimes you win victories and sometimes you face defeats. But in both cases, it's important to leave a mark on history. This crusade was just a chapter in Europe's struggle against the Muslim world. However, it was a chapter that heralded the new campaigns to come. And in those new campaigns, the battle between East and West would intensify even further. Ah, my dear children, Even when I close my eyes, the warmth and excitement of those days come rushing back to me. Saladin. What a powerful leader he was. He was not just a great statesman uniting the Islamic world, but also a loyal soldier fighting for his faith. His story isn't just about one man, it's about the rise of a whole community. Now, let me tell you how Saladin united Egypt and Syria to build an incredible wall of resistance against the Crusaders, and then the unforgettable tale of victory written at Hattin. Saladin's rise was like a storm. In Egypt, a powerful Fatimid caliphate was ruling, but their internal weaknesses and political turmoil weren't hidden from view. It didn't take long for Saladin to notice this. With a clever strategy, he first took control of Egypt, and then aimed to unite with the Zengid dynasty in Syria. This unification would become a huge problem for the Crusaders, because now, instead of scattered and weak emirates, a mighty force was rising under one flag in the Islamic world. The merger of Egypt and Syria not only boosted Saladin's military power, but also his spiritual and political influence. As the divisions within the Islamic world faded, the Crusaders began to feel anxious. They were no longer facing just a few small emirates, they were up against a united force representing the entire Islamic realm. Under Saladin's just leadership, this force grew even stronger. He was skilled not only in warfare but also in diplomacy. He instilled confidence in his allies and struck fear into his enemies. However, Saladin's greatest triumph perhaps crowned his achievements with the Battle of Hattin, one of history's most significant field battles. In the scorching summer of 1187, the day arrived that would determine the fate of the Holy Lands. The Crusader armies had to face Saladin to protect the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But wisdom and strategy always come before brute force. Saladin lured the Crusaders into the sweltering heat of Hattin, drawing them away from water sources to a point where they would be exhausted. This great battle was a testament to Saladin's military genius. And that day, on the hills of Hattin, the Crusader armies knelt before Saladin. No matter how strong and numerous they were helpless against thirst and fatigue. When the battle began, Saladin's soldiers launched their attack with great determination. The Crusaders fought with their finest soldiers, including King Guy de Lusignan of Jerusalem and the Knights Templar. But Saladin managed to defeat them one by one. Even the true cross, a symbol of the Holy Cross, fell into the hands of the Muslims. There was no escape left for the Crusader army. The victory at Hattin was not just a military win, it was the resurgence of the Islamic world. With this victory, Saladin not only broke the back of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, but also shattered the morale of the West, which was the foundation of the Crusades. It would be hard for the Crusaders to accept such a significant defeat. Saladin's military strength and intelligence completely extinguished their hopes. After the victory, Saladin marched towards Jerusalem. Yes, my dear friends, Jerusalem. That holy city had fallen into the hands of the Crusaders and had been under occupation for many years. However, after his victory at Hattin, Saladin was determined to reclaim Jerusalem. The Crusaders tried to defend this sacred city, but after their heavy defeat at Hattin, they were unable to regroup. The city couldn't withstand Saladin's siege for long. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves throughout the Western world. But Saladin's victory was more than just a military success. His mercy became one of the legendary elements of the conquest of Jerusalem. When the Crusaders took Jerusalem, they turned the city into a bloodbath. In contrast, when Saladin entered the city, he showed immense tolerance. The Christians were given the freedom to either stay in the city or leave safely. His actions proved how just and merciful a leader he was in the Islamic world. The recovery of Jerusalem engraved Saladin's name in history with golden letters. In the West, this event created a massive shockwave. The sacred purpose of the Crusades was to seize Jerusalem and establish a Christian state there. But now that purpose had been utterly shattered. Saladin's victory set the stage for a new crusade in the West. Plans would soon be made in Europe to reclaim Jerusalem. However, Saladin would continue to stand firm against the West and symbolize unity in the Islamic world. My children, it is in the footsteps of such great leaders that the pages of history were rewritten. Saladin, not just a commander, but a leader who will be remembered for his justice and mercy, made a mark on history. The great events that took place in the Holy Lands changed the course of the Crusades. And this story was just the herald of even greater struggles to come, because neither the West nor the East would give up fighting for these lands. Ah, my children, the news of Saladin's recapture of Jerusalem resonated deeply in the West, igniting a fire of anger and determination across Europe. Losing such a sacred city like Jerusalem was one of the most painful blows for the Crusaders, and the Western world could not accept it. During this time, some of history's most unforgettable leaders would step onto the stage: Richard the Lionheart, King Philip II of France, and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of Germany. These three great rulers prepared for a campaign with a shared goal: to take back the Holy Land for the Christians. The personalities and stories of these three leaders were the talk of Europe at that time. Frederick Barbarossa was the iron-fisted ruler of Germany, an old and experienced leader who had known the battlefield since his birth, filled with ambition and power. He was highly respected in the West, and his presence was a significant morale boost for the Crusaders. However, Barbarossa's story would sadly end in an unexpected tragedy. They say that while trying to cross the cool waters of the Mediterranean, he drowned in a river. The Crusader army lost one of its strongest leaders before they even reached the battlefield. As a result, Germany's great army had to withdraw from the campaign, leaderless. But the other two rulers, Richard the Lionheart and Philip II, refused to back down from their march towards Jerusalem. Richard was England's brave and fearless king. History remembers him for his courage on the battlefield and his strategic intelligence. He earned the title Lionheart for a reason: he fought at the front lines without fear. But Richard's courage would show itself not only in battle but also in diplomacy. On the other hand, Philip II was France's calm and calculating king. While he might not have had the warrior spirit of Richard, he was a master of diplomacy and politics. Throughout the campaign, there had been frequent disagreements between him and Richard. The ego clashes of these two powerful kings complicated the campaign, yet both understood how crucial it was to reclaim Jerusalem. One of the most unforgettable moments of the campaign was undoubtedly the siege of Acre. After taking Jerusalem, Saladin had also gained control of strategically significant cities in the eastern Mediterranean. Acre was the most important of these cities. For the Crusaders, capturing Acre meant unlocking the path to Jerusalem. Richard and Philip gathered their armies and laid siege to Acre. The siege lasted for weeks, with both sides suffering heavy losses. But in the end, the Crusaders managed to seize the city. However, this victory wouldn't be enough to stop Saladin. At this point, the two great leaders, Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, began to face off against each other. Richard's fight against Saladin was not just a military struggle, it was also a game of strategy and diplomacy. Saladin acknowledged Richard's military strength and determination, but he also held his own in this contest with his cleverness. There was great respect between the two leaders. Legend has it that when Richard fell ill, Saladin sent him his own doctor. Such a great leader didn't see his opponent merely as an enemy, he recognized the greatness in his adversary as well. The capture of Acre and the struggle between Richard and Saladin became one of the most memorable chapters of the Crusades. Richard held the leadership of the Crusader army, but day by day he faced Saladin's resistance and diplomatic maneuvers. The path to Jerusalem remained a challenging and bloody one for the Crusaders. Although Saladin had lost Acre, the war was far from over. No matter how brave and determined Richard was, Saladin's resistance was enough to halt him. Over time, the battles between the two leaders evolved from a power struggle into mutual understanding and a diplomatic war. Saladin did not want to give up Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Richard realized the impossibility of taking it. These two great leaders, who respected each other on the battlefield, would eventually reach a peace agreement. According to the treaty made in 1192, Jerusalem would remain in Muslim hands, but Christian pilgrims would have the right to worship freely in the city. Thus, both sides decided to end the war. However, this peace wasn't a complete victory for either side. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, but its doors were now open for Christian pilgrims. Ah, my children. In this moment in history, we witness the struggle of two great leaders. It's always full of lessons to see how the intensity of war can coexist with diplomacy and mutual respect. Richard the Lionheart and Saladin not only represented warfare but also humanity itself. While battling each other, they acknowledged each other's greatness as well. And this story will continue to echo through the depths of history. Ah, my children. Now we're heading into one of the most surprising and complex periods in history. When we think of the Crusades, our minds fill with images of Jerusalem, Saladin, and the Christian-Muslim struggle, but things aren't always as they seem. This story tells how the Crusaders strayed from their original purpose and veered onto a completely different path. And at the heart of this tale is Venice, the commercial giant of the Mediterranean. It all began when the Crusaders gathered once more for the Fourth Crusade. However, this time they didn't have enough ships to set sail for Jerusalem. Knights from all over Europe sought help from Venice to reach Jerusalem. The Venetians were masters of trade, wealthy, and held power on the seas. The ships the Crusaders needed were in their possession. But Venice, as a maritime empire, prioritized its own interests above all else. They didn't just ask the Crusaders for money to rent the ships, they also offered a different proposal. If you help us, we will provide you with the ships you desire. This offer would completely change the course of history. The leader of Venice, Doge Enrico Dandolo, directed the Crusaders to a Christian city called Zadar. This city was an important trade center for Venice, but it had fallen under the control of rebels. While the Crusaders were burning with the desire to reach Jerusalem, they attacked Zadar under Dandolo's clever plan. The irony of this army, which set out to liberate the Holy Lands, invading a Christian city, highlights a major contradiction of that era. This event marks a crucial turning point in understanding how the Fourth Crusade deviated from its original goals. But this was just the beginning. After capturing Zadar, the Crusaders once again lost their way, this time turning their sights towards Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire. Oh, my children, this chain of events would write one of the most surprising and tragic chapters in the Crusades. The deposition of the Byzantine emperor and Venice's ambition to increase its influence over Byzantine lands lured the Crusaders away from their original mission. The idea of reclaiming the Holy Lands was now overshadowed by the riches of Constantinople. With Venice's shrewd direction, the Crusaders suddenly found themselves attacking the Byzantine capital. It was the year 1204. The Crusaders laid siege to the walls of Constantinople. This ancient city, one of the largest the world had ever seen, held a glorious history. The city was the heart not just of Byzantium but of the Christian world. Unfortunately, the Crusaders showed no respect for this grandeur. According to accounts from that time, the Crusaders besieged the city and ultimately defeated the Byzantines, plundering it. As they roamed the streets of Constantinople, they uncovered some of history's greatest treasures. The churches, monasteries, and palaces in the city were ransacked. Sacred artifacts, golden statues, and precious stones fell into the hands of the Crusaders. Witnesses of that era recount this looting in tears. A journey that began as a holy crusade ended in the tragedy of plundering a Christian city. O my children, here we see how the Crusaders' intentions became muddled. Now it was not Jerusalem but Constantinople that was in their hands. In this city, a Crusader empire was established, the Latin Empire. For 57 years, this newly formed state would take the place of Byzantium. However, the Latin Empire couldn't sustain Byzantium's deep cultural heritage. During this period, the city weakened both commercially and religiously, remaining in Latin control until it was reclaimed by the Byzantines. Just think, my children, the Crusaders who set out to reclaim the Holy Lands ended up fighting against their fellow Christians. Venice emerged as the biggest beneficiary of this campaign. It increased its commercial influence over Byzantium and became one of the greatest powers in the Mediterranean. The Crusaders had captured Constantinople instead of Jerusalem, yet they had strayed far from their sacred goals. So, my children, the Fourth Crusade shows us how history can unexpectedly change direction. Great leaders and powerful armies, no matter how mighty they are, can sometimes be led by interests and ambitions. And we must learn from these stories, understanding these great events hidden in the depths of history. My children, we are once again diving into the depths of history. This time our journey begins with another expedition that the Crusaders set out on in hopes of achieving their goals. Pope Honorius III had learned lessons from the failures of the Fourth Crusade, but he hadn't lost hope. He called for a new campaign. The target was once again the Holy Land, but this time the strategy would change. The focus was on Egypt. Egypt. At that time it was one of the most powerful and wealthiest regions in the Islamic world. The Crusaders understood the strategic importance of this campaign. An army controlling Egypt could open the routes to Jerusalem. But this time they needed to fight not just with swords, but also with their wits. Pope Honorius III hoped that the riches of Egypt would whet the Crusaders' appetites. However, my children, sometimes in history it's not the greatest victories that teach us lessons, but the bitter defeats. The Fifth Crusade is truly a tale of such a defeat. The armies reached Egypt, and their first target was the city of Damietta in the Nile Delta. Damietta was one of Egypt's most important cities. Capturing it could open all the doors to the country. The Crusaders besieged Damietta and had some initial successes. The city was taken, but what happened next turned into a great tragedy. The waters of the Nile emerged as an obstacle for the Crusader army. The floods and swamps of Egypt halted their advance. While the army struggled with the water, Egypt's defenders took full advantage of the situation. My children, here we see the Crusaders' helplessness against nature. For all their powerful armies, they bent the knee to the might of the elements. The Crusaders who joined this campaign were burning with dreams of wealth and victory. But alas, those dreams were swallowed up in the deep waters of the swamps. When the Crusaders thought they had achieved a tremendous success by capturing Damietta, they soon realized that the heart of Egypt was not so easily taken. Sultan al-Kamil, with his strategic brilliance, defeated the Crusaders and secured a significant victory in Egypt. At this point, the Fifth Crusade entered history as a failed campaign. However, my children, even though this campaign ended in failure, the Crusaders didn't give up on returning. The Sixth Crusade, however, was conducted in a much different manner, relying on diplomacy rather than swords. At the forefront of this campaign was Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. But Frederick was very different from other Crusader leaders. He chose to achieve peace through negotiation rather than fighting against Muslims. This created great surprise among many Christian Crusaders, as they believed that bloodshed was necessary to reclaim the Holy Land. However, Frederick chose a different path by using his intellect. Frederick began negotiations with Sultan al-Kamil. My children, these negotiations are among the most interesting moments in history. Two great leaders met not on the battlefield but at the negotiation table. Frederick's goal was simple: to regain Jerusalem. Al-Kamil wanted to ensure the safety of Egypt. Ultimately, the two leaders reached an agreement through peace. Jerusalem was handed over to the Crusaders without bloodshed. However, this wasn't a victory achieved by shining swords, it was a success gained through diplomacy. But my children, this peace agreement led to significant controversy among the Crusaders. Many did not see the return of Jerusalem this way, without fighting, as a true victory. Nevertheless, the Sixth Crusade went down in history as one of the rare victories achieved through diplomacy. Frederick II would be remembered as the leader who won this success. However, this victory only allowed the Crusaders to hold on to Jerusalem for a short while. In the following years, this holy city would once again fall into Muslim hands. Do you see, my children? Sometimes victories that aren't won on the battlefield are achieved at the negotiation table. Yet the value of these victories depends on how history remembers them. Just like victories won by the sword, those gained through cleverness are also important lessons from history. Ah, my children, once again we're stepping into the dark and winding paths of the Crusades. This time our journey will focus on the grand yet tragic Crusades of France. The French were perhaps the most stubborn and brave warriors among the Crusaders. But unfortunately, stubbornness and bravery don't always lead to victory. King Louis IX of France was so passionately committed to the Crusades that it felt like he had dedicated his life to this cause. Let's delve into the story of his campaign together. The Campaign of Louis IX. This name was a beacon of hope in the Christian world. Even while sitting on the French throne, King Louis always had Jerusalem on his mind. He burned with a sense of noble duty. He was determined to reclaim the Holy Lands from the Muslims and return them to the Christian world. However, as with previous campaigns, fate had another path in store for him. Louis IX set out with a grand army, and the target was Egypt. Egypt was one of the strongest strongholds under Muslim control, and King Louis aimed to conquer Egypt to secure the route to Jerusalem. He directed his forces toward the city of Damietta, moving forward with hopes of a great victory. When the Crusaders finally reached Damietta, the memories of past campaigns were still fresh in their minds. But Louis was confident. The city was captured, but my children, once again, fate would thwart the Crusaders' ambitions. The dangerous rivers and swamps of Egypt brought great disaster to Louis's army this time. After gaining success at Damietta, the Crusaders tried to advance further into the interior. However, faced with Egypt's harsh natural conditions and the strategic genius of Sultan Baybars, the Crusaders suffered another heavy defeat. Louis was captured under these difficult circumstances in Egypt. Yes, a king was taken prisoner. This was a significant source of shame for the Crusaders. Louis was released for a hefty ransom, but this defeat deeply shook the faith in the Crusades. The struggle to reclaim the Holy Lands once again ended in victory for the Muslim world. But my children, King Louis did not give up. Despite his first failure, he attempted to organize another campaign, this time to the north, toward Tunisia. Unfortunately, fate would be cruel to him once again. While participating in the campaign in Tunisia, Louis fell ill and passed away. This was perhaps one of the most tragic moments of the Crusades. A king had lost his life for the sake of the Holy Lands. However, even after Louis's death, the struggle of the Crusaders did not come to an end. The last campaigns led by France would mark the final resistance of the Crusaders. These last crusades by France were filled with consecutive failures against the Muslims. The Crusader armies were now far from their former glory. The Muslim world, especially under Sultan Baybars and the subsequent Mamluk rulers, had achieved great victories over the Crusaders. The Crusaders were now trying to maintain a presence in the Holy Lands as mere small garrisons. But the most significant blow came in 1291 with the fall of Acre. Acre was the last major stronghold of the Crusaders in the eastern Mediterranean. This fortress had become a symbol of the Crusader states. However, under the leadership of Sultan Khalil, the Mamluk armies besieged Acre. This siege is recorded as one of the bloodiest and most devastating moments in Crusader history. When the Mamluk armies entered the city, the Crusaders made one last stand, but it was futile. The fall of Acre marked the end of the Crusades. The Crusader states in the eastern Mediterranean were systematically destroyed. The Christian world had completely lost its control over the Holy Lands. My children, since the day the Crusades began, many wars, struggles, victories, and defeats have taken place. The hopes that began with King Louis IX's campaign came to a complete end with the fall of Acre. The collapse of the Crusader states created a great disappointment in the Christian world. The return of the Holy Lands to the Muslim world overshadowed the Crusader ideals in Europe forever. You see, my children, history sometimes holds not only great heroics but also great tragedies. No matter how great Louis IX's courage and devotion were, the realities he faced were much stronger. The defeat of the Crusaders in Acre proclaimed the end, not only of a city but of an entire era. The bloodshed for the Holy Lands had resulted in a victory for the Islamic world, not the Christian world. My children, I'm going to take you on a journey through the deep marks that the Crusades left not just on the battlefields, but also along trade routes, in the heart of cities, and even in the palaces. These campaigns went far beyond just being religious struggles. The interactions between the East and the West began along trade routes and spread into the cultural and intellectual realms. But these interactions were so deep and complex that they shook the very foundations of Europe's socio-political structure. Let's explore together how these significant interactions shaped the course of Europe. Though East and West had seemed like opposing worlds for centuries, the Crusades turned that perception on its head. When the wealth of the East met the greedy trade mentality of the West, both sides began to influence each other more than ever before. The magnificent caravans of the Silk Road were filled with spices, precious stones, and exotic fabrics, introducing Westerners to the riches of the East. Just think about it, food, spices, and textiles that had never been seen in the West before started coming from the East. In Europe's largest markets, Eastern spices were worth their weight in gold. Over time, traders began to bring back silks, spices, and artworks from the East that they had never encountered before. On one hand, Europe's appetite was growing, while on the other, the wisdom and aesthetics of the East were quietly seeping into the West. The dazzling civilizations of the East became a source of inspiration for the unspoiled lands of Europe. From architecture to engineering, medicine to philosophy, the Crusaders returned with knowledge they had learned from the East. Just imagine. Until then, Western doctors viewed bloodletting as the way to cure an illness, while Eastern medicine aimed to treat the disease itself. The fame of Saladin's physicians was so immense that it would astonish even the doctors of the West. This exchange wasn't just about material wealth. Westerners were introduced to the scientific advancements of the East. The profound knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and medicine from the Islamic world began to illuminate the dark ages of the West. The Crusader knights returning from the East didn't just come back with memories of battle, but with fresh ideas as well. However, the impact of the Crusades in Europe wasn't limited to trade and cultural exchanges. These grand campaigns also laid the groundwork for events that would shake Europe's internal political structure to its core. The nobles who participated in the campaigns, the large landowners, had to spend their wealth to equip and finance their armies. Many lords and barons sacrificed everything for the sake of the Holy Lands, and when they returned, they found themselves depleted and weakened. This vulnerability allowed the central kingdoms in Europe to gain strength. Lords who could no longer defend their lands had to seek protection under the kings. The crumbling of the feudal system led to the rise of powerful kingdoms, especially in places like France and England. During the campaigns, many lords had to sell their estates, allowing kings to directly control large tracts of land. My children, this significant change profoundly shook the foundations of Europe's political landscape. Not only the economic and political structures were transformed, but the role of religion in Europe also evolved into a different dimension due to these campaigns. The Crusades reinforced the power of the Church, while simultaneously exposing its weaknesses. The devout knights who joined the campaigns made great sacrifices for their holy duties, but they were deeply unsettled by what they saw upon their return. Although the Church appeared to represent the spiritual force behind the campaigns, some of its moral weaknesses came to light during the Crusades. The Pope's desire to be the most powerful figure in Europe led to much unrest within the Church. Particularly, alliances with major trade cities like Venice overshadowed the Crusaders' pure religious motivations with commercial interests. This situation undermined trust in the Church. Yet still, my children, the Church managed to weather this storm. Especially after the campaigns, it continued to grow stronger by controlling the emerging new religious sects, trade routes, and even direct governance in Europe. My children, although the Crusades are remembered throughout history for bloody battles and great destruction, they also formed a bridge between the West and the East. This bridge left lasting marks not just on trade routes but also in the cultural and intellectual realms. The once closed doors of Europe were opened by these campaigns, and the riches of the East transformed the thought process of the Western world. At the same time, they triggered deep changes in Europe's political structure. The Crusades not only rewrote Europe's destiny, but also prepared it for future major transformations. Ah, my children, do you see? History is written not just on battlefields, but along trade routes, in the political games within palaces, and in the streets of cities. The Crusades shaped Europe not only through wars for the Holy Lands, but also through these monumental changes. Now close your eyes and breathe in the atmosphere of that era. Picture the spice-scented bazaars of the East, the cobblestone alleyways of the West, and the intrigue-filled palaces of kings. The true legacy left behind by the Crusades lies in these great transformations. My dear children, we have reached the end of this long and turbulent journey. The Crusades weren't just a few bloody battles or conquests in history. They were a time when religions, cultures, and nations came together, clashed, and profoundly influenced one another. These conflicts, which spanned centuries, opened new horizons, shifted power balances, and laid the groundwork for the emergence of great empires in the future. But most importantly, the Crusades remind us how humanity has acted, transformed, and evolved in pursuit of grand ideals and beliefs. Throughout this lengthy narrative, we've witnessed the ambitions of kings and sultans, the sufferings and sacrifices of soldiers, and the rise and fall of cities. The struggles for the Holy Lands became etched in history as a battle not only of swords but also of beliefs and ideals. Yet we know that, like every major war, the consequences of these campaigns went beyond mere destruction. East and West came to know each other again, learned from one another, and ultimately, the paths of two seemingly opposing worlds converged. At these points of convergence, trade took the place of war, and curiosity and discovery replaced hatred. The rich culture of the East shed light on the dark ages of the West. Science, art, literature, and even commerce all benefited from this great meeting. Humanity evolved not just through blood and tears, but also through knowledge and understanding. Even today, we can see the echoes of that era in architecture, literature, and thought across the globe. Dear children, the lessons from history are endless. The Crusades show us how struggles for great ideals can transform, how war can give way to peace, and how hatred can turn into exploration. History is not just a record of what happened in the past, it is also a guide that illuminates our future. If we learn from it, we can prevent history from repeating itself and build a brighter future. As I bid you farewell at the end of this long journey, I hope each story I've shared has left a deep mark in your minds. Remember, history is not just a memory of the past, it is a mirror that shapes who we are and who we will become. As we look through the dusty pages of time, we are also embarking on a journey within ourselves. This journey reminds us what it means to be human. Now, my children, I call you back from the vast waters of history to the shores of today. But know that this story doesn't end here. Until we meet again in future tales, flip through the pages of history books, trace the footprints of forgotten civilizations, and most importantly, look at the world with fresh eyes. Because history lives on with us at every moment, everywhere. In every stone, every written text, and every relic. Until the next story, let's gather once again. Farewell, and continue to explore the endless narratives of history with curiosity.